Welcome to our session on teaching science. It's going to be that time of year again where we are all excited for the new school year. I'm not sure what your new school year is going to hold this year. You might find yourself as a new teacher expecting many new things. Maybe you even changed grade levels, or maybe you're continuing to teach some of the things you've already taught in the past. I do know, however, that the Lord has promised to be with us throughout this school year. I hope that the next few minutes that we spend together are both an encouragement and an inspiration to you as you're preparing for your science lesson. My name is Candace McQueen. I'm a fourth grade teacher at Pensacola Christian Academy. I truly love fourth grade, and one of my favorite subjects to teach my fourth graders is science class. One of the reasons why fourth grade science is so much fun is because our students like it. Sometimes I have students that want to press that fast forward button each day so that they can skip to our science time together, but that's not the only reason why I like science class. I think science class is an excellent time to continue to develop and deepen our students' biblical worldview. It's wonderful when we learn those biblical truths in Bible class, whether it's through the story, the song time, or through a Bible verse that we've been learning. But it's important to take that Bible truth and continue to weave it throughout the rest of our day. When our students notice us doing that, I think they're going to continue to keep Christ as the center of their life. Our science class is filled with many facts and diagrams and charts, but it should also be filled with our Creator, His handiwork, and His love for us. As I was beginning to think about how we should start talking about science at the beginning of a school year, I was thinking about what the foundation of a science class should be. As a Christian school teacher, the foundation of my science class should be the same as the foundation for my life, which is Christ. Genesis 1:1 tells us that in the beginning God created, and God created so many things for our students to learn about, whether it's a unique animal or a distinctive system for us to study about. In fact, as I am preparing for my science lessons, I routinely find myself in awe of our Creator. And it's so much fun to come to school the next day and to share that with my students. God didn't just create His creation without a purpose, though. The purpose for creation was to glorify Him, and we can glorify the Lord through our science classes. The Abeka curriculum does a beautiful job engaging students in science classes. In 3rd through 6th grade, we spend the first portions of the school year going through our science textbooks and curriculum. And then later on in the year, we transition into a health book where we study about the body that God gave us. Let's take a look at what each individual grade is going to be learning this year. In 3rd grade, students learn about the first 6 days of creation, with each chapter diving deeper into each of those days of creation. They really enjoyed their book Exploring God's World as they study about matter and energy, and they even blast off into outer space and study how God created the atmosphere and solar system. Many students really enjoy studying their favorite animal and its habitat later on in that book. 4th graders start off the year by studying the scientific method. This is a wonderful tool that allows them to dive deeper into some new material as well as some new demonstrations. Whether studying matter and energy or plant and animal design, 4th graders are able to see God's fingerprint all throughout their book, Understanding God's World. In 5th grade, students love to learn about mammals, geology, and oceanography. They are able to see God's design in each chapter of their book, Investigating God's World. One thing that they especially love in their book is the study of astronomy as well as engines. It's an exciting time. 6th graders continue to build upon the knowledge that they've learned throughout their elementary science classes as they continue to study biology with the structure of plants and animals, and they widen their knowledge on geology and outer space. They even begin to learn a few terms that have to do with chemistry, and this really helps them as they're preparing for junior high and high school. We all know that an effective lesson begins with effective preparation. There are some different things that I found helpful as I'm preparing for my science class. And one thing that I've recently started to do is to study a chapter at a time. I have found this super helpful, not just in helping me to know where we're going, but helping me to know about some different activities that might be coming up. Some of these activities include tests and quizzes, which come up often in our curriculum, but sometimes there are special projects my students are going to need to complete or some demonstrations that I will need to prepare for, and I have found this very helpful as I get ready for each lesson. After I study a chapter at a time, I don't stop there. My preparation continues, and each night before I teach a lesson, I make sure to read through the pages and study my curriculum to make sure that I'm prepared for that next day. It doesn't stop there though either. I have to take into consideration how am I going to plan to teach these terms in a simple way that my students will understand and also in a way that they're really going to enjoy. Sometimes this means I create a PowerPoint so that there can be some terms displayed for them to see, or sometimes I write on the chalkboard the terms that are needed for each lesson. No matter what system you use for preparation, remember, in order to have a good lesson, we need to start with good preparation. Well, after we have prepared for our lesson, it's time to begin teaching. And as I begin teaching, the first thing that I look for is that my students are paying attention and they're focusing on the lesson. One great way to make sure our students are paying attention is to use an attention getter. And I've really found that if I can get my students' attention at the beginning of a lesson, I have a much easier time while I'm teaching throughout the lesson, making sure they're staying focused. One thing that we're going to get to see in just a minute is an attention getter, and I know you'll really enjoy that. But you may be thinking, how do I come up with an attention getter for science class? There are some different things I like to do. Sometimes I tell my students a story from my childhood. They really like to listen to times when I was much younger than I am now and some things that I did back then. And sometimes I let my students be involved in my attention getter. Maybe they'll act something out. Or if one of my students has some extra knowledge about a subject and I know that in advance, I'll let them come up and maybe show something that they have at home to help get my students' attention. Well, in just a minute, we're going to get to see Mr. Reynolds. He's a 6th grade teacher and he is introducing a health lesson. I want you to look for some things though while you're watching him. I want you to think, is there a lesson that you teach that you could do a similar attention getter?
Students, prepare for health. Today we're on page 42. I know you're scared, I know you're nervous, but how many of you thought I was? Choking. Yeah, I was choking. Today we're going to talk about what would you do if you saw someone choking. What would you do? How would you react if you were choking? We're going to figure out what things you should do in those instances. You know, I fell on the floor and most likely, I was still cognizant, but most likely if I was out of consciousness, I would have probably hit my head on the floor and I would have a splitting headache when I woke up. There are different types of injuries that can happen when you hit your head on the floor. One injury that can occur with a scalp injury or a brain injury is called a concussion. Another injury is called contusion. I might get a scrape or a cut. If you get a scrape or a cut on your head, you want to make sure you apply pressure to it like we've learned about with our other wound care. Apply pressure and you might need a bandage or you might need to go to the doctor's office depending on how big the cut may be. Call for medical help if necessary. As I mentioned, there are 2 types of brain injuries that we're going to look at in our reading today. One is called a concussion. One is called a contusion. The main differences between those two is that a concussion is a jostling of the brain. It doesn't cause a whole lot of damage, but just a moving of the brain inside the skull can cause a concussion. A contusion is when you have multiple concussions and it actually causes a bruise on your brain. How many of you have ever gotten a bruise on your arm or your leg? Yeah, those things hurt. Well, you can't necessarily push the bruise on your brain, but if you were to have multiple jostlings, maybe if you play football, or if you were in a pretty severe car accident, or maybe you're in a really bad bike accident, you could have multiple brain injuries. That can result in a contusion and really cause harm to your brain. It could cause unconsciousness where you wouldn't be awake anymore. And it could even cause a clear or reddish fluid to come, unfortunately, maybe out of your nose or out of your mouth. So if you were to fall and hit your head, that would help you to know how serious the injury is. If you've got maybe a nosebleed or maybe an ear bleed, that's not normal, unless of course you hit your nose. But if you had just hit your head and you get a little bit of a reddish fluid coming out of there, you want to go to the doctor right away. That indicates a brain injury. You know, if you were to start choking on food, research has shown that most people choke on food because they are laughing. Isn't that kind of interesting? Most people, they choke on and they laugh because you're trying to swallow food down and air at the same time. So it's okay to tell jokes and to have a good time at your meals, but make sure you swallow your food first and then tell a good joke and have everyone roaring out loud. If you were to find someone who is unconscious, you know, I've had CPR training. I know maybe you've had parents in here that have had CPR training. There are things that they teach you in order to help someone. One of the first things that they do is to tell you to get help. Now, in here, you probably can't go call 911 in our classroom. Who do you think you should go and get if I were to fall unconscious in the room? Yes, ma'am.
You get the principal or an officer.
That's right. You would run down to our principal's office. You would maybe run next door to our teacher next door, and you would get them to get help. If you were in public, you would probably want to call 911 first, or have someone else, hey, you, go call 911, and you would assign them that job of getting help there. If someone is not breathing, you want to make sure you look for an open airway first. If they're lying on the ground and you can safely roll them onto their back, you want to make sure you look into their throat. See if there's something blocking the way. You might be able to just pick that chunk of steak out of their mouth. Not that you necessarily want to, but hey, it could save their life. You could pull that piece of meat out and let them breathe again. Maybe you look down and you don't see a clear passageway. Then you might want to give them what's called a rescue breath or use rescue breathing. Now, people have become much more cautious about helping people, especially in this time of a pandemic that's going on. You don't necessarily want to breathe down someone's mouth or have them breathe into you, but when it comes to life or death, saving someone's life, you want to make sure you do all that you can to help them. So you look, you see if you can find something, you can't find anything, so then you give them what's called a rescue breath. You give them a deep breath down in their lungs. Once you've tilted their head, lifted their chin, you want to look down there again. Do you see anything else? Has their chest begun to rise, or their stomach begin to rise, or is it still still? If you need to, you may continue with using compressions. Another way to help someone who is choking, if they are alert, if they are awake, and they can get a little bit of movement, you want to do what's called the Heimlich maneuver, or abdominal thrust. Say that term. Abdominal thrust. An abdominal thrust is where you take your fist around somebody, put it right above their belly button, and squeeze up and in as hard as you can in order to get them to push that food or whatever may be blocking their passageway out. What if you began to choke when you're by yourself? You might have to do an abdominal thrust on yourself. So you would need to find a chair and do the same thing and pull yourself against that to get that blockage out of your throat. As you see here, we have our friend Bob. Everyone said, hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob.
Bob is not feeling too well. He's kind of blue. He's blue, okay? Bob is a safety person that we can use to practice these maneuvers on. I would take Bob, I would make sure I want to look down his throat, I would lift his chin, and I'm even going to put my hands on his forehead, push it down, pull that head back, and you want to look down and see if you can see anything. If I can see something, I want to grab it out. If not, I want to do the hook and scoop. Take my finger, arr, everyone would say arr. Arr. I want to hook, and now his mouth is not very big, so I can't get my finger down there, but I want to hook and scoop if I can and lift it out of there. If that doesn't work, here I go. Give him a rescue breath to see if you can get that food out of there. Get it down. And if that doesn't work, and all else fails, you take your fingers, interlock them, and then you want to lock your elbows, and you want to start pumping. In order to give him what we call CPR. Now again, there should be other steps that you follow before you do any of these things. First thing you want to do is to
Get help.
get help. And then you want to ask them if they're okay. If they're not okay, then you can continue helping them medically speaking. Let's take our books, open them up to page 42. Some of you are already there. And let's begin reading from our lesson today.
Wow, he definitely got my attention. And I can only imagine that every student in that classroom was so worried about their teacher to see why in the world he had fallen on the floor. And then after they made sure that he was okay, I can only assume that they were very curious about why he did all that. Then probably when they got home that night, that was probably the first thing that they told their parents. And so not only was Mr. Reynolds able to use his attention getter to get his students' attention, but then even after his students went home, I think they probably retaught their science lesson to their parents that night. And so that was a really good example there. Well, after we have our students' attention, it's time to teach them some new material. And lots of times we think of this as the most important part of our science lesson. There are some different ways we teach new material in science class. And one of those ways is by using a chart. Here you see a chart on my easel that would teach a fourth grade class about the different light waves and the different parts in a light wave. You probably have science charts that you use in your classroom, whether it's on a PowerPoint or on your chalkboard. I think these can be a really great tool in our science class. Whenever I know I need to use one of these science charts, I try to come up with a song to help my students learn the new material. And if you were to ask my students about my class, they would probably say that we sing throughout all of our subjects. And I really have found that if I can put some information to song, it helps my students to learn it, and it makes our class more fun, and it even helps parents to kind of realize, oh, this is really important, so the teacher made a song about that. Sometimes people will ask me how I come up with so many different songs for my subjects, and I thought I'd fill you in on a little secret. I just get out my Sing Unto the Lord book that I use during Bible class, and I take that and the different information that I need to teach my students, and as I'm flipping through my songbook, I hum tunes that are familiar to me, and I try to match that up with a different material. And then once I have one that works out for that science lesson, I'll teach it to my students, and they get really excited about that. Well, I said I was going to show you one of my songs, and this song goes to the tune of This Is the Day. I use the same pattern that I would in a Bible class in teaching a new song. The first time I sing the song by myself, and then the second time I allow my students to hum along with me, which helps them to become familiar with the tune. And then the third time they sing it with me. The tune I chose for this song is This Is the Day. And one of the best things about using this tune is that because it naturally repeats, students pick up on it very well. Well, here is our light waves chart. Let's learn about the different parts of it. God made the light, and it travels in waves. The crest is the highest, and the trough is the lowest. God made the light, and it travels in waves. The crest is the highest, and the trough is the lowest. Amplitude, strength, and the wavelength. My boys really like the portion of that song where we talk about the strength of a wave. They really like to show off their muscles. And that's a really fun way to introduce some new material in a memorable way. We don't just introduce new material in science class with charts though. We often have terms and definitions to teach our students. Something that I have found helpful in my fourth grade classroom is to obviously have terms on my PowerPoint or on my chalkboard, but then to give my students a simplified definition. I found that if they can hook on to the simplified definition, it allows me to build upon that later on throughout the lesson. You may notice that your science class is a little bit different than your history class. History class flows more like a story, and science is filled with many charts and diagrams and facts that your students will love. We have beautiful books that come with the Abeka curriculum, and while these books are great tools for us to use, we would never want them to replace us as teachers. So always make sure you are prepared and you're teaching your lessons first, and then finishing up class with the review. Well, we have an opportunity to step into a 4th grade classroom. This time we're going to get to visit Miss Amsbaugh's class. She's reviewing some material in a 4th grade science class. And there are some things I want you to look out for. See if you can notice how she's able to quickly go through some material, and see how she keeps her students' attention. Maybe you'll see some techniques that you could use in your own classroom.
Let's start off today by going over our invertebrate characteristics. Read them together with me. Ready? No backbone, usually have weak muscles, usually are small animals with soft bodies, may have an exoskeleton, cold-blooded. Good, let's do it one more time. Ready? No backbone, usually have weak muscles, usually are small animals with soft bodies, may have an exoskeleton, cold-blooded. Okay, and then we just recently learned this. So before we pull up our stickers, repeat after me. Head.
Head.
Thorax.
Thorax.
Abdomen.
Abdomen.
Head.
Head.
Thorax.
Thorax.
Abdomen.
Abdomen.
Spiracles.
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 Antennae.
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 Compound eye.
Compound eyes.
Alrighty, let's see. Students watching, who would you like me to pick today? Trayston, are you sure? Okay. Let's see how he does. Oh, you know what a head is. Good job, Trayston. Good. And one more, the spherical. Perfect. You got a spherical on either side. Oh, look at that. You put it back. Excellent job. This would be something that we want to make sure that we know how to label. So let's go over it one more time. Head.
Head.
Thorax.
Thorax.
Abdomen.
Abdomen.
Spherical.
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 Antennae.
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 Compound eye.
Compound eye.
All right, now it's my favorite part. All our delicious bugs. Repeat after me. Monarch butterfly.
Monarch butterfly.
Ladybug.
Ladybug.
Housefly.
Housefly.
Grasshopper.
Grasshopper.
Flea.
Flea.
Firefly.
Firefly.
Dragonfly.
Dragonfly.
Cricket.
Cricket.
Cockroach.
Cockroach.
Honeybee.
Honey.
Beetle.
Beetle.
Ant.
Ant.
Wasp.
Wasp.
Termite.
Termite.
Praying mantis.
Praying mantis.
Mosquito.
Mosquito.
Monarch butterfly.
Monarch butterfly.
Ladybug.
Ladybug.
Housefly.
Housefly.
Grasshopper.
Grasshopper.
Flea.
Flea.
Firefly.
Firefly.
Dragonfly.
Dragonfly.
Cricket.
Cricket.
Cockroach.
Cockroach.
Honeybee.
Honeybee.
Beetle.
Beetle.
Ant.
Ant.
Wasp.
Wasp.
Termite.
Termite.
Praying mantis.
Praying mantis.
Mosquito.
Mosquito.
Okay. In our lesson today, we are going to talk about and read about how many animals, specifically insects, they go through something called metamorphosis. Now, when mammals are born, and maybe you've gotten to see this, I know I got to see this growing up. Our dog had puppies. They were so cute. And when puppies are born, they look like what they're going to look like when they grow up. They're just smaller and cuter when they're first born. Kind of like you when you're a baby. You're smaller and cuter, and then you grow up to be beautiful or handsome. But when you're a baby, you're small and cute, okay? Now, when insects are born, they hatch from eggs, and due to something called metamorphosis, they actually change form. So we have two types of metamorphosis. We have complete metamorphosis and incomplete metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis, we see this in a butterfly. So a butterfly starts out as an egg, and it hatches, and it's a caterpillar. And then that caterpillar, after a while, it goes into, depending on if it's a moth or a butterfly, it turns into a chrysalis or cocoon, wraps itself up, and it's in there for a little while, and then it emerges into a beautiful butterfly or a nice big moth.
Wow, that was so much fun to watch her in her 4th grade classroom. I was always encouraged by how much she was able to accomplish in her class. I really liked how she went through the different charts and flashcards, and she simply stated the terms and her students repeated them. And I think that allowed her to get through a lot of information. Did you notice anything that Miss Amsbaugh did in order to keep her students' attention? I really liked the interactive slides that she was able to use. Those are really fun and a great tool to use in our classrooms, but I noticed that she only had one student use those, and I can only imagine that every student in that classroom was working really hard to have that opportunity. Well, after we've effectively taught the material, it's time for us to go into the textbooks and begin reading to reinforce what we've already taught. Something that I find really helpful in my class, whenever we prepare for science class, I have my students get out 2 books, their science book and then their STEM activity book, and then they place that underneath their desk. That way, if we need our STEM book during the review time, or when it comes time for the oral reading portion of our lesson, they're able to be quickly prepared with me. During our oral reading time, I tried to call on a variety of students, and I don't really like to go in a pattern around the class where my students will know who's getting to read next. I try to pick individuals sporadically throughout the class, and this helps keep everyone on their toes and stay with us during the reading. We don't just read and read and read in science class, though. We take time to pause and ask questions. And this is a good time to gauge whether your students are understanding the material you've taught. You know, there are times when I think I've had a beautiful lesson and we get into the reading and I realize my students are just not comprehending what they need to. And that's okay. I go back to my PowerPoint and I reteach the material maybe in a little bit of a different way to help my class. Sometimes we have the opposite thing happen though. Sometimes we go throughout our lesson and our reading and things are going so well that when it comes time to the questions, my students are getting question after question right. And it's at those times when I feel really victorious that I need to continue to build their critical thinking skills by taking those questions to the next level. Another thing that is important to add into our science class is biblical integration. And our science classes are filled with facts. We teach those to our students, we read about them, and then we even end our science class with a review time. But if we leave out the Creator, we've left out the most important part of our science class. So make sure that you are keeping Him as the focal point of your class. Let's take a look at a 3rd grade textbook. 3rd graders truly love learning about animals and their habitats. On this page, I want to point out some different things to you. The students are reading about food webs, and they really enjoy this. This page is reinforcing what the teacher already taught. If I was using this page in my classroom, I know I could call on 2 or 3 students to read this material. And then did you see on the side how it gives the teacher some options of questions to ask to her students? What a wonderful tool we have there with the Abeka Teachers Editions. I want to point out some questions that are at the bottom of this page. Look at how it says, what are the producers? This is a factual-based questions that a 3rd grade student should be able to answer towards the end of this lesson. This question is going to continue to build as it asks the students to name the predators and producers, and then to also describe and really defend their answer of which animal is the top predator. If time allowed in that classroom, I'm sure a teacher could take it to the next level and ask the students why and give them an opportunity to defend their answer even more. Well, let's go into the 3rd grade book once again. This time I wanted to draw your attention to this page because I loved how the Bible was integrated both in the teacher's key as well as the student edition. On this page you're going to see this bubble that has a verse from Job in it. And whenever we come to one of these boxes in my science class, my students and we read these verses all together so that we're all on the same page and reminding ourselves about how great our God is. This page is continuing to talk about the habitats of different animals and specifically of predators. But the students are going to be questioned about how is God the wise designer on this page. Let's look at the teacher edition. You'll notice that it challenges the teacher to use this as an opportunity to have some discussion in her classroom to describe why is God the wise designer. Well, now that we have effectively used our beautiful textbooks to reinforce what has been taught, it's time to review. And I think review time is one of my favorite times of class. And I think I like that because it's so competitive. Review time in a science class is not just going to be at the beginning or at the end, but really should be all throughout. Let's talk about that first review. I find that the first review is so helpful to myself just because it helps me to get back into science mode, whether we just taught science yesterday or it's been a weekend, to help refresh myself and remember the different things we've learned. I've noticed in my class that students who maybe have been absent for a day or two, they really enjoy that first review. It helps them feel more confident. Even though they miss some material, they're able to get back with the class and really kind of know what was going on. We just talked about how we review throughout our lesson and throughout our reading, and that is a very important time in our review. But now we're going to talk about some written review. And I want to take you to a 4th grade page this time to look at. Many of my students really enjoy this geology chapter and learning about the different types of rocks. And this is a portion of written review that is provided by Abeka. Sometimes we use this for homework and sometimes we use this in class to do together. I want you to notice how Abeka has chosen to use some higher level thinking questions on this page. The first questions are going to allow students to show off their knowledge about rocks, and they're going to get to put them in non-renewable and renewable categories, but we're not going to stop the questioning process there. Later on, this page is going to ask them to defend where they think fossils would be found in the different rock layers. And that's a really unique time to get to share different answers with the class and kind of discuss that. My favorite portion of the review time comes even after this, and that last review can be so much fun because it's a time really where we get to include mini games. I have so many games that my students love, and one thing that I've recently started to do is to use Abeka clip art that has to do with our science chapter to make PowerPoint games that are really detailed for each chapter. And I like making those because they're new and they're engaging to my students, but also they don't take up a lot of room in my classroom, and so that can be really helpful. My favorite review game to play at the end of a science lesson, if we're running out of time, is a game that I call Row versus Row. And my students love this game so much. In fact, as soon as I say it, you'll see students all across my classroom sitting up really nice and tall because they want their row to be chosen. I choose 2 rows and they stand, and they know that the first child in each of those rows gets an opportunity to answer the first question. So then I ask a question, and whoever answers it correctly, and is the first one to answer it correctly, they get to go to the back of their row. And we continue this until there's only 2 students left. Sometimes this means we have a student from each row, and sometimes we end up with having 2 students from the same row, which can always be an interesting competition. And then we get to finally have a champion. Some things that are really nice about this game, it doesn't take really any prep work except for you need to make sure you have your questions ready. And also you're not taking up time calling on different students' names and deciding who gets the question. So if you run out of time, you may find that as a helpful game at the end of your science lesson. Well, something that we're continuing to work on in my classroom, and no doubt in your classroom, is continuing to have our students not just answer fact-based questions, things that we've taught them, but really to get them thinking in that higher level. Let's take a look at a 5th grade textbook and see how the Abeka curriculum is helping these inquisitive students continue to answer even more deeper level questions. Let's look at the first question on this page. It says, what did Tim learn in science that would make him think about bringing oxygen? You may think that sounds like a strange question. Above this portion, the book tells the students that Tim is going on a hot air balloon ride, and he thinks he needs to bring that oxygen with him. I'm sure there are some 5th graders who may be on Tim's side and thinking that what he did was necessary. There may even be some students who would think that that wasn't necessary, and you could have some good opinions come out through that in your classroom. The next question is kind of an open-ended question. It says, what do you think will happen? Anytime we can ask our students a similar question, we know we are going to get some unique answers and help them to think. This question, though, in the book is referring to a time when the moon blocked the sun and how the people in New Guinea, they thought the world was going to end. And I can imagine that if you ask this question to your students, they would come up with some great answers about what they think would happen next. But I could also see how a teacher could take this question and turn it into a discussion about the Bible and how the Bible says God created the world and how God's always promised to be with us. There's one more question I want to look at on this page. It says, why was she surprised when she looked up into the sky? This question is talking about a student who's made a big move. She's moved from Peru back to Nebraska, and when she looks into the night sky, she's not able to see all the constellations that she's used to seeing. I hope many 5th graders would be able to explain that different constellations are visible in the southern hemisphere than are in the northern hemisphere. Well, let's keep looking at our 5th grade textbook. On this page, students are going to be reading about oxygen and water. While these things are both essential to life, let's look specifically at this question. It's asking the students to think about what would happen if the condensation point of oxygen was higher. Well, that question even made me start to think about oxygen and what I know about condensation points. As 5th graders continue to read about water on this page, they're going to have an opportunity to build upon the knowledge that they had in 4th grade and continue to grasp a firm foundation of science. That's something I really like about the Abeka curriculum, is students will learn something in 1 grade, and the next grade they're able to add more to that, and that can be really fun. Not only is critical thinking an important part in our classroom, but so is discussion time. And if I were to be honest, sometimes I shy away from having a discussion time in my classroom just because it can easily get out of hand. So something I really am going to try to do this year is to plan a discussion opportunity each week. There are some things that you're going to want to look out for as you're planning these times. I think the first thing you're going to want to think of is, what can my class handle this year? We know that each year our classes have a little bit of a different likes and dislikes and can handle different things. And so because of that, you may pick a different thing to discuss each year in each chapter. Another thing you might want to be mindful of is your time. Sometimes a discussion can lead to a story, which can lead to another story, which could easily eat away all your time that you have for science that day. And so just make sure you're being mindful of that. I have found it helpful whenever we start a discussion time in my science class to remind my students of our routines, how we talk with permission, and something that I think as teachers we are good at hearing an answer that may sound a little silly to us and responding in a kind way. Well, our elementary students don't know how to do that yet, and so they have to be reminded to do that and even given examples of some different things they can do. After you give your students opportunities to have time for discussion that you've planned, I think you're going to notice that this is going to begin to happen more spontaneously and be a really productive time in your science class. I want to show you a 6th grade book now. In this 6th grade book, you're going to see how the Abeka curriculum encourages the 6th graders to discuss something. Let's see what they're going to discuss today. 6th graders really enjoy learning about how God designed their bodies to work efficiently. And on this page, the students are reading about the lymphatic system. I specifically want you to look at this discussion question. How does tissue fluid give first aid within the body? Well, in order for a 6th grader to answer this question, they're going to need some prior knowledge. They need to know what tissue fluid is, and they need to know how their body systems work. Once they put those two things together, many of the 6th graders could give a reasonable answer to this question. I can imagine, though, if you were to ask every 6th grader this question, you would get very different answers. And that's okay. And I think a 6th grade teacher could take this as an opportunity to say, Sally answered the question this way, and she has some really good portions to her answer. And Sue, she answered it, and she came up with some good reasons, too, and how they could combine those answers. That's a great skill for those students to learn. Well, after we have effectively reviewed and challenged our students not just to think, but be able to discuss in our science classes, we want to continue to effectively learn with STEM. You may be wondering, what is STEM? STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. Now you may be questioning, can all those things take place in an elementary classroom? I assure you can, and it can be a really profitable time in your classroom if you allow it. Well, why should we have STEM in our elementary classroom? I think the first thing that we can talk about with STEM is how it develops critical thinking skills. It is wonderful for us to teach new information, for our students to review and read about that information, but it's another thing when they have to take some different materials and kind of recreate what we've taught them about. STEM time can be a really enjoyable time for those visual learners. As you're getting to know your class this year, you'll probably recognize that there are some students that could read all day long, and then there are some students who would rather not read at all during the day. Those students are really going to perk up in your science lesson when you get to do these STEM demonstrations. STEM really is fun. And if you prepare for it, I think your students will really look forward to that. In fact, my students really get excited when they see I have different materials out on my side counter, and they know we're going to do something fun in our science lesson. STEM also helps point us to our Creator. I said that STEM develops our critical thinking skills, but it also can point back to how God created different things for us to use. And even when things don't go so well in our STEM experiments, whether because we're missing a material or we just made a mistake, we can point back to God doesn't make any mistakes. And I think that's a really good thing for our students to know. Well, we've talked about the purpose of STEM, but there's a little bit of a process that comes with having these STEM projects, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful for the Abeka curriculum. At the beginning of my 4th grade science curriculum, I'm able to see lists of materials that I'm going to need for these STEM demonstrations. I'm just so grateful that I don't have to flip through all my science books to find out what I'm going to need this year. As a mom and as a teacher, I am really grateful that these STEM experiments are not just in our books to be exciting and fun, but they're really placed into these lessons to enhance what the teacher has taught. And so they're not a waste of time. They really are helpful. You'll notice that you will find STEM experiments both in your regular textbook as well as your workbook. And so it's kind of fun. We get to keep our students on their toes to see when they're going to get to do that next experiment. Well, as you're preparing for your STEM STEM demonstrations, you're going to need to gather some supplies. And one thing that I really like about many of my demonstrations is that I already have the supplies I need at home or maybe even in my school classroom. If you don't have something that you need for one of your STEM experiments, you could probably ask someone else within your ministry, or oftentimes I have parents that always ask me, Mrs. McQueen, is there anything you need for your classroom? And one of the families within your classroom may just have what you need. After I've gathered my supplies, it's time for me to plan for those STEM lessons. And like I said earlier, when I'm reading through my chapter, I start to plan for my STEM demonstrations. I gather any materials that aren't going to spoil or aren't going to make a mess right away, and I put those in my closet so that I can easily prepare for them the night before. The night before, I like to take out the specific things that I need for that demonstration and put it on my side counter, and that helps me not to forget about what I need to do that day. And then my students all day long are looking forward to our science lesson. One thing that's very special about the STEM time in our science class is it helps us to use the scientific method. I want to show you a chart that we use in 4th grade for the scientific method. We start this at the beginning of the school year in 4th grade, and then we're able to continue to use this throughout the rest of the year. I like to teach my students a song with this, and I'll sing it for you, and hopefully it'll be a help for you even as you're transitioning to STEM time. I will use a scientific method, observe and ask some questions, form a hypothesis. I will experiment and gather data, study it to find a conclusion. This is a wonderful thing for students to learn. They're very observant in 4th grade, and they always notice different things, and they're very inquisitive. They like to ask questions, but we want those questions to lead to some more good information for them to learn. I always find it interesting when we come to the time where students form a hypothesis. As I'm teaching my students about a hypothesis at the beginning of the year, I ask them, would it be reasonable for Mrs. McQueen to cancel homework all year long? And some of them think that it would, and some of them realize that that's not reasonable, and so that would not be a good hypothesis. After we find our hypothesis and we get to continue our experiment, sometimes students will become so focused on the experiment, they forget to write down that important data that they need. And then finally, we have to wrap up our experiment and come up with a conclusion. And hopefully, if we've done our experiment correctly, it'll match with what we've learned that day. Let's jump into the 4th grade textbook. I want to show you this specific STEM activity. I love how the Abeka curriculum leads us through the scientific method. Let's look at this page. It's going to ask them to identify 3 different types of variable: independent, controlled, and dependent. But then do you see how at the bottom of this page, number 4, it asks students to compare their results? Then it continues by making it go a step further and asking them to think about some more information. Well, now we're going to get to step inside of a 3rd grade classroom. You'll see Mrs. Bryant in this science class do a demonstration with her students. I want you to look for a couple different things. How has she prepared, and how does she use this demonstration to reinforce what she has taught that day?
In the smaller cup, I'm going to combine some water and coffee grounds. So I'm going to add a little bit of water. Making coffee is one of my favorite things. Maybe we can enjoy a cup once we're finished with our experiment. Then I'm going to pour my coffee grounds into the water. Okay, and I'm going to mix those around a little bit, stirring them up so that they combine with one another. Now for this experiment, the water is acting as water like it would be in the ocean or in a lake. The coffee grounds represent oxygen molecules in the water. The coffee filter is an example of how fish gills work to be able to catch the oxygen molecules from the water. Jake, would you come to the front and help me with this? Jake's going to help secure. You can step right here to the side. I'm going to take my coffee filter and place it inside of my larger container. I'm going to take a rubber band to secure it so that we don't have a big mess when we're finished, and hold that coffee filter in place. Now Jake's going to give me some extra support, and he's going to put his hand right there around it to make sure that it doesn't fall off. Now that I have this mixture of coffee grounds and water, I'm going to pour it into the filter. The water should flow through the filter, but the coffee grounds should remain on top. Just as a fish would be able to catch the oxygen molecules, but the water would continue to flow over their gills. So let's see what happens. So Jake has it nice and secure for me. Make sure that you have plenty of room when you do this experiment so that the water doesn't overflow. And you can see that water is flowing through. Now that water is much darker because the coffee grounds are very dark as well, but none of the little pieces, the grounds of coffee, are falling through the filter. All of them are remaining on top of the filter, just like the oxygen molecules stick to the fish's gills. Jake's doing a great job of helping me here with this. And over time, as this continues to filter through, the coffee is going to stay on top and the water would be at the bottom. I'll take this for you so we can hold it up and take a closer look. And you can see that there are no particles floating in the mixture at the bottom, but all of them are resting on top in the filter. Maybe this is something that you would like to try on your own sometime. If you have the supplies, it's a lot of fun to see how the gills of a fish work.
I really enjoyed watching Mrs. Bryant's demonstration. I noticed that she was really prepared. The things that she needed for that science demonstration were really simple, but she was able to complete this demonstration in a really short amount of time because she had everything laid out in her classroom. Something I also enjoyed was how she was relaying the things that were happening in the demonstration back to her lesson. And that's kind of like what I said before. Our demonstrations and our STEM experiments should really be enhancing what we are trying to teach our students. While many students enjoy learning or continuing the learning process in different projects that we complete that have to do with the Abeka curriculum, one thing I like about project time in science class, it allows me as the teacher to really get to know my students' different personalities, and some of them really take these projects very seriously. I think project time is also special because students can defend their answers and what they truly believe about our Creator. Well, let's take a look at this next slide where you're going to see some pictures of some different projects that are available in the 3rd through 6th grade curriculum. 3rd graders have an exciting opportunity to share their knowledge of different animals during the animal notebook section of their science curriculum. I was recently talking to a 3rd grade teacher. She said she was really grateful for the pacing that Abeka does through the animal notebook, and she said this was a great opportunity for students to begin the research process and writing paragraphs. She did recommend that you write some of them together, and then as students get used to this method, they can continue to write some of those on their own. Well, 4th through 6th grade science class is filled with many projects. And at PCA, we've chosen to make some of these into different reports or posters. One of the 4th grade reports that we do is called the State Resource Report. And one thing that's neat about this is it corresponds with the My State Notebook in history class. And so students are getting to learn about different things in different subjects, but then they're able to wrap those up and put them together, and so that's a really fun time. In 5th and 6th grade, they get to do a space report, a bird report, and an astronomy report. Some of those reports curriculum suggests for them to be oral reports, and I know some 5th graders really like to have their information put on a 3x5 card. That way when they get up in front of their friends, they feel more confident and are able to give a good report. Well, students really do enjoy making posters at the Academy. The Abeka curriculum suggests doing different things for these projects. Sometimes it suggests a poster. I know that the curriculum has even mentioned doing a PowerPoint presentation and some different things that would be fun. At the Academy, we have decided to do a poster in each grade. Our 4th graders do a bird poster as the optional research report. 5th graders get to do a poster about mammals, and then 6th graders finish out their posters in elementary school with a tree, and that's really fun. Something we've asked our students to do on these posters is to write information on note cards and then place those note cards on the poster. So not only are these posters very beautiful, but they're also very informative. I know your students will enjoy getting to do some different projects this year in science class, and I hope that you enjoy learning more about your students as you grade those. Well, I want to thank you for listening to this session, and I hope that you will enjoy your science class and enjoy your students during that time this year.